We are joined today by Emily Wyche from the Southern Environmental Law Center. She is their senior attorney. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Of course, I'm really excited to talk about data centers.
So part of the issue from what we have gleaned and what we've been reading about, it's the way that these are being presented to the public, or I suppose not being presented to the public. We're sort of hearing of these things as being very hush-hush, very backdoor, and it makes it all seem a little bit on the shady side. What are you aware of in that orbit?
Yeah, I mean, that is a huge problem with these data center projects. And honestly, I think one of the big components for the significant public opposition we're seeing to them. We've seen examples of local government officials signing NDAs or non-disclosure agreements where they basically agree not to disclose certain information about the project, even when the project has an approval pending before that local government that citizens have a right to know about and know what their elected officials are voting on. We have, in response to Freedom of Information Act requests that we have filed with local governments, which is a state law that allows citizens and organizations to request public information from state and local governments. We've seen documents that basically show these projects are often in the works for months and have pretty much, had approvals ready to go and baked in before the public is ever made aware that there is a data center proposal being considered by their local elected officials. And so it's been a huge problem we've seen across South Carolina and across the Southeast, where my organization, Southern Environmental Law Center, is working on these issues. And, it's both a lack of transparency about whether it's a data center at all, what kind of project it is, and also a lack of transparency about the specific impacts the project will bring to the local community.
It makes it difficult for people to be represented if agreements are being made without the people being able to voice their opinion on them.
Right. And another big problem with this lack of transparency we're starting to see is, the reality is local governments and local elected officials are not experts on everything. They're not experts on data centers, and they're not experts on the Federal Clean Air Act and, water use and, energy use. All of these issues that come up with data centers, local elected officials aren't necessarily experts on those things. And so when the entire conversation is just happening between the data center company or the data center developer and the local government, a lot of that information is not disclosed or is not disclosed, in our opinion, accurately or fairly by the data center developer. And when the public is cut out of part of the conversation or all of the conversation, you don't have groups that understand these data centers like SELC or just citizens who have learned about these from neighbors and other communities who have dealt with data centers. You don't have them with the ability to share information, sort of to counter whatever points the data centers are making to local government. And so local governments don't get a full picture of what the project is that they're considering either. So lack of transparency in itself is a huge problem in terms of just how our democratic process is supposed to work. But it's also a big problem in just making sure local governments really understand what they're approving and what they're signing off on.
Are there other terms that are being used? You mentioned that they may not even present themselves as a data center per se. Is there other terminology that they're using to kind of slide in under a term that's becoming a little taboo or passe?
Yeah, usually the problem is that they are just referred to by like secret names, like this NorthMark, NorthMark's Valara Data Center in Spartanburg was referred to, I think, as Project Mach 1. We've seen Project Liberty, Project Boulder. So, I mean, just these totally nondescript names. And all you see on council agendas is that the local government is considering, you know, either a tax incentive or a purchase agreement or some other maybe innocuous seeming approval of Project Boulder or Project Mach 1. And so it doesn't tell you anything about what the data center is.
If you're not in the know, then you don't know. Yeah.
Right. And yeah, exactly. And I think another thing we've seen, especially with NorthMark's Valara Data Center, is referring to it as a high performance computing center. When it was first rolled out to the public, there was one local elected official who explicitly said this is not a data center, which was fairly misleading. Now, I'm not an expert on, this exact topic of, like terminology and the appropriate, my general understanding is maybe high performance computing centers are, a certain type of data center. So, it may be technically the Valara data center is also a high performance computing center, but the reality is the commonly understood term is data center.
Right.
And so to be transparent with the public and to make sure residents and citizens know what county council is considering, we need to be calling these what they are, and they are data centers, and not sort of playing around with terminology of is it a high computing facility versus a data center. They're data centers.
Yeah, ultimately it's one and the same. And it makes you wonder, like you said, without the people who are signing things being experts, if they aren't being a little tricked, by the terminology themselves. And, yeah, again, like you said, not being sure what they're signing off on.
Right. I mean, there was even one local elected official in Spartanburg who basically admitted in an interview with a local newspaper, the Post and Courier, that if he had been told the full scope of the Valara data center's plans to build this large gas plant, it went over his head, and he didn't realize what the full scope of impacts was going to be.
Yeah, well, that's unfortunate. Speaking of representation and taxes, when this is discussed, the discourse is often brought in about taxes and bringing in jobs and bringing money into the area. Based on some of what the number of jobs coming in compared to the tax incentives that are being offered to the people that run the data centers, are these data centers ultimately a good deal for the area? Like, is it going to pay for itself? Is there payoff to it?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not a tax expert. I'm not, an expert on these sort of financial issues. But what I will say is, one, it's right, they do not create that many jobs. I think NorthMark said when proposing the Valara data center that they would create at least 27 jobs. I mean, that's nothing. I think the pitch that is made to local governments by the data center companies and developers is that this facility will bring in a significant amount of tax revenue to the county, based on, not only some property taxes, but also the equipment they are purchasing for the data center. So I think that's the pitch that gets made, is there's going to be a large amount of tax revenue. And because they're creating so few jobs, there's not going to be a corresponding strain on local infrastructure. There are not going to be tons more people coming in for these jobs who are going to be using the roads and public schools and needing housing. So the pitch, I suspect, that is being made to local governments is like, hey, this is basically free money. We will give you a lot of tax revenue, and you won't have to spend a lot to update your infrastructure to accommodate us. The problem with that narrative is it completely misses and fails to mention all of the numerous negative externalities and impacts that these data centers are bringing. Maybe they don't strain local infrastructure and local schools and housing stock, but we know that they can cause significant air pollution in local communities, use a significant amount of water. They can completely change the dynamic of communities where they're locating, cause noise pollution, light pollution, clear trees and wildlife habitat. So, saying they won't have this really specific kind of infrastructure impact is really missing the full scope of what these facilities are bringing. And again, that's the problem with this lack of transparency is local elected officials and communities, they are entitled to make decisions about what they want to see come to their communities. And maybe one could decide that if a data center is sort of appropriately located in an industrial area, the tax revenue is worth some of the negative impacts. But communities and residents are not being allowed to make that decision or weigh in on it. It's being made for them, usually behind closed doors, and that's a really serious problem.
Yeah, and without their input. And I know one of the things,
Right.
environmental things aside for this moment, is, all of the who's paying for all of the energy and the power and the water and all of these sorts of things that run through these, does that balance out, and how much of that is the community having to pay for?
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's a great question. And it's the reality is there's nothing in South Carolina right now or many states that, you know, ensures you and I and other ratepayers are not footing the bill for the, transmission upgrades and the gas build out that is happening to serve these facilities, or, upgrades to the water system to serve these and accommodate these facilities. So there's nothing that is stopping those costs from being put onto us, the ratepayers, rather than the data centers. And that is a huge problem. I know we've heard pledges and promises that data centers will pay for this type of infrastructure build out when it is necessary to accommodate their facility. But, one, those are not binding and they're not guaranteed. The other thing is, we'll hear data center developers saying, we're going to cover the costs of the transmission upgrades needed to accommodate our facilities' energy needs. That is just a fraction of what we're talking about when we're talking about what ratepayers might be on the hook for. There's a data center in Colleton County, South Carolina, that is a great example. It would use 1,000 megawatts of power, which is a lot of energy. Right now, Dominion Energy and Santee Cooper, two of our state utilities, are building a $5 billion new gas plant, or they are proposing to build a $5 billion new gas plant in Colleton County that would be producing 2,000 megawatts of energy. So half of the energy this $5 billion plant is adding to the electric grid could be used up by this single data center complex if it were built. It's, like I said, costing $5 billion. And, Dominion Energy and Santee Cooper have both said to the General Assembly that more than 50% of their expected future load could be coming from data centers. But this data center company in Colleton County was certainly not suggesting they were going to foot the bill for over 50% of this $5 billion gas plant. It was about some probably relatively minor transmission upgrades. So, there's nothing preventing us from having to foot the bill. And even when we hear these promises and pledges made by data center companies, they're really not talking about paying for the truly expensive infrastructure that's getting built to accommodate them.
The checks and balances do not seem to be checking and balancing,
Yes.
unfortunately. So speaking of the water, so from what I was seeing is that one of these data centers uses as much water as 2,000 houses would on the regular. How does that, like locally in Spartanburg, do we have that water? I mean, do we have the easy ability to let that water go? Like, do we have that? I'm really poorly framing this question.
No,
Can we has do?
yeah, I mean the water question is a big thing, is a big data centers. I think in Spartanburg we have seen recent reporting about Spartanburg Water asking residents to curb their water use because of the drought that's impacting South Carolina. And so to then have this data center using a really significant amount of water makes one question if that is a wise decision. The local water utility has said they can more than accommodate this use. It's kind of hard to make those two things work with asking people to curb their use of water during a drought, but saying they can accommodate another large user. I will say I don't know the specifics of this NorthMark facility and what capacity Spartanburg Water has, so I don't want to say definitively that they cannot accommodate this use. I think with data centers, a lot of it is they are coming very quickly in large numbers to across the United States and including in the Southeast and South Carolina. And so, even if Spartanburg Water can accommodate this data center, there have been other data centers proposed in Spartanburg that would also have used public water had they not been, stopped by public opposition. So the question is, even if you can accommodate this one, can you accommodate 10 more? At what point are they going to cause a really significant strain on water infrastructure? The other thing about water and data centers that I think is worth talking about is, more recently we have seen data centers moving to this closed loop system for cooling their servers. It's cooling the servers that requires all of this water. And historically, data centers have used this evaporative cooling technique, which is the really water intensive technique. More recently, we've seen this closed loop system that is less water intensive because they are reusing the water. And that in theory is a good thing, but because it is newer, we're still learning about potential drawbacks of this closed loop system. One thing I've heard of, I can't expound on it because I'm not an expert on this piece of the technology, but we've at least heard there are some concerns about what's called PFAS, which is a type of, it's called an emerging contaminant, but it's a contaminant found in water a lot of the times, and it can cause any number of health impacts when it's, consumed or you're exposed to it over a long period of time. So we've heard that PFAS might be present in some of the waste streams of these closed loop systems. And interestingly, the Valara Data Center, it was reported recently that they are going to have to monitor for PFAS in their wastewater discharges. And so, maybe they're using less water, but then are they putting a bad pollutant into the water system when they're discharging their wastewater, and then how do you sort of balance that trade-off? So maybe that we have this newer technology that's less water intensive, but it could have a whole host of other problems that we're still learning about.
You're solving one problem and
Yeah,
causing a whole other one. It's
yeah.
like, it's literally pick your poison. It's kind of
Right.
what
And,
it sounds
I'll
like.
say, I know this is not an interview about PFAS,
Right.
but
Yeah, sure.
if you ever wanted to do one about those, we've got great experts at SCLC, and I'll say, there is treatment technology to ensure PFAS doesn't end up in local waterways. And so that's one of the points of making sure we understand the full impacts is like great if they've identified a new technology that's less water intensive. But if it is going to have PFAS discharges, then we need to make sure they're also now going to treat PFAS so it doesn't end up in the local water system, or Spartanburg Water isn't on the hook for having to treat it themselves. So that's sort of, that's why understanding the impacts and transparency, getting back to, I think, like a common theme with these data centers, that's why that's can be so important, is it's not to say there's no solution, and, even finding a new technology like this is still bad. It's that, okay, if there are other impacts, let's see if we can deal with those and really come to a solution that has, as minimal as an impact as possible.
The air pollution issue is not necessarily new to Spartanburg County, because they had another plant down there that caused, or they had a plant down there that had some air, my understanding is, had some air pollution concerns.
Mhm.
So it's not necessarily new to them, but what industrial emissions is pretty common to them. But do we know if data centers are any better or any worse with their air quality emissions related to what they're already dealing with?
Yeah, so there are, I will say I'm not familiar with kind of the background issue of air pollution in Spartanburg as well, but what I can say about the NorthMark data center in
Mm-hmm.
Spartanburg, or the Valara data center, is, it's proposing its own on-site power plant to run the facility. And it is doing that with a series of 24 generators, and 11 turbines run by natural gas.
Hmm.
450 megawatts of gas power is the equivalent of like a utility scale power plant that's powering thousands of homes. But the difference is a utility scale power plant is maybe made up of 3 or 4 large turbines versus 11 turbines and 24 generators. And one of the important differences is the way data centers are building these sort of pop-up makeshift power plants, they are less efficient. And so they're actually more heavily polluting than an equivalent sized power plant that, Dominion Energy is building, for example. And so what NorthMark's proposal is, and the Department of Environmental Services recently released a draft permit showing what the estimated air pollution would be from this power plant. They would be, a leading source of particulate matter pollution in the state of South Carolina, not just in Spartanburg County, but in the state of South Carolina, and potentially a leading source of formaldehyde emissions in the state of South Carolina. And particulate matter pollution can be a really harmful type of air pollution. It's also referred to as PM 2.5. It's these really tiny, fine particles, and it can increase the risk of hospitalization due to asthma, pneumonia, cardiovascular disease, stroke, sometimes even cancer when exposed, even at low levels, sort of over the long term. And then formaldehyde is actually identified as a carcinogen by the EPA. And so this facility's on-site power plant is going to be a really significant source of some harmful air pollution. Mm-hmm. And it's surrounded by neighborhoods. And so that's just to put it into context, this is not just any other industrial facility with some air pollution. This will be a really significant source of air pollution in the community. Not every data center builds its own power plant on site. Valara, I think, is one of the first, if not the first, to try this in South Carolina. We have seen this happen elsewhere in the Southeast. But the other sort of type of air pollution you can see from data centers is, the Colleton County facility is a great example. They are connecting into the electric grid, and they're requiring 1,000 megawatts of energy if it were to get built. This is just in a proposed phase right now. If it were to get built, they would require 1,000 megawatts of energy from our electric grid. Adding that demand to the grid is one of the things that utilities are using to justify building more gas power plants and gas pipelines in South Carolina. And so, even though the power plant is not on the same property as the Colleton data center, like it is on the Valara property, we are still getting new gas plants being proposed in South Carolina in other communities that will contribute to air quality issues and air pollution in those communities. And so it's, maybe not directly tied to that data center, but it's being caused by that data center, among other things. So those are kind of the two different ways they are contributing to worsening air pollution.
It's building upon itself.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, in some cases next to itself. So
yes,
it is. And it's not like air just hangs over. You know what I mean? Air doesn't hang over one place and stay.
Right, exactly.
Wind is a thing, and so it affects any area around. I guess it sort of depends on how long it takes for things to dissipate, but it is
dissipate and how high the smokestacks. It can get really technical, but the reality is, again, with NorthMark's Valara Data Center, I mean, there are neighborhoods right there. There are folks who live, just a few hundred feet from the facility. So it's not like it's in this industrial zone where there are no homes or businesses nearby. It's surrounded by homes.
People who at this point are not being properly represented on this issue, if they're aware of it.
Right, and were not informed last year when their local elected officials were issuing tax breaks for this project. The community members were not told that this data center was going to have a power plant on the property.
Seems like something you would want to know.
Yes,
hundreds of feet from your home.
Yeah.
That's widely unfortunate. In doing my research, some of the pro data center things that I found mentioned that they were not noisy, which seems to be contradicted by anything else that I've run across. do we have research on these? Are they, what do we know? Like, are they noisy? Do we have facts on this particular issue?
Yeah, I don't have sort of like the expert take on the noise of data centers writ large. I suspect it is project specific, and a lot of it depends too on like, where is it located? Is it located right next to houses? Is it located in otherwise really, really quiet rural community? Is it located in a really urban area? So some of it, I think, probably depends on where it is located and what the background noise is. In terms of the servers, I'm less familiar with the noise pollution that is created by the servers in data centers, though I've heard that as a concern. I just can't speak to that. I can speak a little bit to, again, going back to NorthMark's Valara Data Center, the 24/7 running of basically this power plant on site. Um, some turbines that produce power are like jet engines. I mean, they can be really, really loud. And at least there's a facility in Memphis called XAI that is run by, it's Elon Musk's data center company. And they, like NorthMark, are using about 400 megawatts of turbine energy to power the data center. Um, the XAI facility, we have heard from residents, they can hear the turbines running 2 to 3 miles away. I mean, that's really far away. And again, there are people who live much closer than 2 to 3 miles to NorthMark's Valara data center. Now, I will say one of the problems with XAI is that they are completely trying to avoid and evade pollution controls. Um, NorthMark is getting, a Clean Air Act permit. They'll have to put pollution controls on their turbines. In theory, that should cause some sound dampening, but we don't know how much. They certainly have not said anything about that, about what the decibel levels will be. And so what we're left with is, again, a data center company that is sharing absolutely no information with the impacted communities, local officials who are not sharing any information with the impacted communities, and then sort of like a common sense gut reaction that surely this is going to be really loud for people who are living nearby. And that's all we have to go on, because neither the data center developer, nor the local government will share any concrete information about the proposal.
Again, transparency. Like, it
Yeah.
seems like
Yeah.
we have a theme.
Yeah.
We have
Right.
found the crux.
Yeah,
We found the
exactly.
crux of this particular issue. So NorthMark has come up a lot, and that's our closest one to us in Spartanburg. We have also heard things about Project Spiro over by Tiger River, and there's another one, Cielo, out in Cherokee County. With NorthMark, our closest and most knowledgeable friend, where is that? Do you know where they are in the process of getting that built, or are we still in the discussion phase
Yeah.
of things?
So they are under construction. They received some initial approvals last year. This is part of the problem with how it was rolled out. It first came up that county council was considering a tax break for Project Mach 1. And it was labeled as a high performance computing center. We knew that they were going to be producing their own on-site. We suspected it was a data center, even though that was not being disclosed. It was revealed that they were going to produce their own on-site power, but they wouldn't use more energy than the existing Kohler manufacturing plant, which we didn't think was using a significant amount of energy. And so that's all the public knew last year when county council was considering this tax break, a fee in lieu of tax agreement. Shortly after they got that tax break from the county, they applied for a permit from the South Carolina Department of Environmental Services to generate about 50 megawatts of power on site. They needed a Clean Air Act permit for the pollution that would come from that. We submitted some comments, we got some improvements on the air permit, but 50 megawatts, I mean, it's not great, but it's not a stunning amount of on-site energy. And it was only earlier. And so after getting those sort of initial approvals, they started construction. But we recently learned that just 3 months after getting that initial Clean Air Act permit, they were starting the process of modifying that permit to add 400 more megawatts of generation. They refer to this as a phased approach to the
Mm,
project.
yeah.
I'm not a business person, but 3 months in between the two phases seems questionable to me. That just, whether it was intentional or not, the reality is the public was made to believe this was going to be a relatively small facility. And then it quietly proceeded with plans to become a massive data center with a huge power plant on site. And so, because they received some of those initial approvals last year, they have started construction on sort of this first phase of the data center project. They still need a new Clean Air Act permit for the vast majority of the air pollution they'll be contributing to the area. They have a minor land development application pending before Spartanburg County. It seems nonsensical that this would be considered minor, but that is what they have applied for from the county to permit some additional construction work on the property. So they have some approvals, they have some construction ongoing, and now they are in the process of getting subsequent approvals for the next kind of phase of the project.
It sounds like it sounds like the Southern Environmental Law Center is following this very closely.
Yes.
And is that just, sort of finding ways as you go to sort of track and keep them honest with what they're
Yeah.
doing? Is just, finding places to jump in.
Yeah. So I mean, the most obvious, the thing that tipped us off to this increased power generation was I sign up for public notices from the South Carolina Department of Environmental Services anytime a permit request is filed with DES. And so I just got an email showing that Valara had requested a modification of their air permit, which I was just curious what they were requesting. Mm-hmm. So I submitted a Freedom of Information Act request this spring. And when we got the documents, that's when we realized they were adding a massive power plant to the site. Fortunately, with the Clean Air Act permit, that is a very formalized process. So there's a 30-day public comment period where the public and groups like SCLC mm-hmm. and groups that we represent can submit comments, raising concerns, raising legal problems with permit, technical problems with the permit, any number of issues we or the community identify or have with the draft permit. And then DES is holding a public hearing where folks can speak about concerns and ask questions about the permit at the end of June 25th at 6:45 in Spartanburg. And so that's a very formal process that we and others can weigh in on and participate in. The other thing we're looking at is, just making sure we know what other approvals are pending for this project and what approvals they need, but maybe don't have yet. So we're trying to make sure we understand sort of the full scope of every decision point and approval that is going to be necessary for this data center and where the opportunities are for both SCLC and Spartanburg residents to weigh in.
Has there been anything that either organization or community input has done to slow this down at all?
This specific project, I think, we learned about this change and this addition of the added 400 megawatts of mm-hmm. power in April. So it's still a relatively recent
okay.
It's still relatively recent information. So public opposition is building and people are really starting to speak out. And so I am hopeful that it will slow down and put a pause on this project. But I think that some of that momentum is still building right now. I think that the public hearing at the end of the month is going to be a really important opportunity for folks to, really expressed their concerns about how quickly this project seems to be moving forward when a lot of questions and impacts are sort of left unanswered and unaddressed.
We have found the crux of this particular issue to be transparency. But what we have found with just about every other topic that we've covered is the real key is talk to people, get involved, and make yourself heard.
Yep. Yes. And
That's
I'll say at other data centers, the Colleton County Data Center proposal, when folks learned about that, they learned about it early before it received any initial approvals. And, the public notice was very small in a local newspaper, but someone saw it, folks in the community learned about it. And 2 weeks later, when there was a public meeting on this local zoning approval, hundreds of people showed up and spoke in opposition to this proposal. Um, Southern Environmental Law Center also filed a lawsuit challenging the ordinance allowing the data center to go forward in Colleton County. That lawsuit is still pending, but I will say after the significant outpouring of opposition, we have not seen a subsequent attempt to move the project forward in the county. And they actually recently put forward a temporary 6-month moratorium on data center approvals in Colleton County in order to sort of revisit how they are thinking about siting data centers in Colleton County. And so that's a great example of public opposition working to both slow down a project and hopefully get some improvements to the local laws governing data centers in the county.
June 25th.
Yes, June 25th is
June
the
25th.
DES public hearing.
That's everyone's chance to get out there and have yourself heard.
Yes,
Love
exactly.
that. So there's now a bill that has been introduced in the South Carolina legislature, S-867, checking my notes so I get that number correct, that is meant to clarify some of the shady business and rules and regulations around data centers. Does it do enough to protect the people from what it
stands? There were a lot of data center bills pending in the General Assembly this past session, which I think shows that people generally agree we have to get a handle on these data centers. And the reality is we need South Carolina lawmakers to establish statewide guardrails to ensure that data center development minimizes impacts on nearby communities, to the environment, to electric customers. We need all of that addressed. No bill is going to be perfect, but we were happy and excited to see attempts to put in place the statewide framework. Unfortunately, none of the data center bills passed before the end of the session this year, but we're hopeful that, next year during the next session, we will see more data center bills that focus on, proper siting, provisions to ensure that the energy these data centers use don't lead to more air pollution or higher power bills, and also just increased transparency requirements for the facilities.
Well, they seem to be aware that that's an issue, so at least it's a good first step.
Yes, exactly.
It's definitely moving in the right direction.
Right.
So many things that we talk about, it's hard to counter. Like we talked about things like domestic violence and things like that, where, there's not someone who's pro domestic violence. This is not one of those situations. There are people that are pro data center. And realistically, we live in this land where everyone saves things on the cloud and everything goes to a server. Somewhere, these data centers have to exist. There's got to be a way. Is there a solution? Is there a way to fix it without ruining the environment? I mean, it seems dramatic, but
I do want to be clear that, SELC as an organization and me personally, we're not against all data centers, right?
Sure.
Because to your point, I think you may find someone make a great argument to be totally against data centers. I'm not saying there's not an argument to be made wholesale against them, but, I think me personally, it seems like whether we need them or not, they are coming, and people are using AI. And so, then the question is the one you just posed, like, how do we deal with this new industry that is coming at a really rapid pace. And, I think obviously the theme of this conversation has been transparency. That is one critical piece, is data center developers, data center companies, local governments have to start being more transparent with local communities when these projects get proposed at the very beginning before any approvals are issued for them. I mean, that is key to improving this process. The other thing is appropriate siting. I mean, you would not put a Walmart supercenter in the middle of a neighborhood, right? You would not put a really heavily polluting aluminum smelter right next to a daycare. I mean, we have zoning laws, right, to appropriately site different types of development in communities. That's not a big ask. Data centers are in this weird place where they are trying to locate, put a data center with a power plant next to a bunch of neighborhoods, or in Colleton, put this massive, almost 900-acre data center complex in the middle of one of South Carolina's most cherished conservation areas. They are trying to locate them in just wildly inappropriate places that no other industrial development of that scale would be moving forward. And
Right.
so that's another part, is appropriate siting. I mean, we have industrial parks that are set aside away from residential and business areas for a reason. And that is because, like, we put industrial things over here, so their impacts are not being felt, right next door by the person
At the
who lives
daycare.
next to
Yeah.
them, right? So there's transparency, there's appropriate siting, and then on the environmental impacts piece, what I was saying earlier about water use, it is, identifying and adopting these new technologies that allow them to use less water, and also understanding what other impacts might come from those new technologies, and also addressing those with appropriate, treatment and mitigation. And on the energy side of things, it is, investing, these data center companies investing in clean, renewable energy instead of being a driving force behind a massive build out of really heavily polluting gas infrastructure. So I think it's, transparency, it's siting, and then it is minimizing environmental impacts to the greatest extent possible. And it is possible. We just haven't seen it in action yet. But in theory, there is a data center out there that could, I assume, check all of those boxes if they were motivated to do so.
It can be done. Well, thank you so much, Emily, for taking the time
Of course.
and clarifying things for us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Do you have anything that you didn't get a chance to get out that you wanted to put out there? Anything to add?
I would just encourage folks to, if they're concerned about data centers in their community, I would really encourage folks to start reaching out to elected officials now about, where they stand on data center developments, and what, if anything, is being done to get ahead of the problem in their communities. One issue we see is that, it's all behind the scenes, and then you have 2 weeks and there's a public hearing to prepare for on a data center. You have to learn everything about it, and it's this fire drill to deal with the problem. On Southern Environmental Law Center's website, we have actually a guide for local governments to use. It's called Getting It Right, that helps guide local governments on the best ways to regulate these data center developments. And so I would encourage folks to go check out our website and check out that guide and share it with local elected officials and local governments, and really try and encourage these conversations to start happening, and this planning to start happening before there is a data center project being proposed in your area and you're having to respond in a really rapid amount of time. We're seeing an increasing number of local governments also put into place moratoria while they kind of think through how to approve data centers and whether
Right.
they want them in the community. So I would also encourage folks to reach out to their local governments about putting in place that type of moratorium while they, think about whether data centers are a good thing for the community, and, if they are something that the community wants, where should they be located, and how can we ensure that they're minimizing their impacts?
Just common sense, I think.
Yeah, common sense and participation in your local government.
It always boils down to get involved.
Yes, exactly.
Always, always.